Good evening, I'm Lawrence O'Donnell, and welcome to the next 100 days. It was a very bad day in the presidency of Donald Trump. Donald Trump had to get rid of the first big player in this White House that he has had to get rid of. That was today. And today, a federal judge appointed by Donald Trump ruled against Donald Trump. It's a turning point. We are at a turning point. Heck of a job, Brownie. That was a turning point for George W. Bush. When President Bush said that to his FEMA director in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, everyone knew that Brownie wasn't doing a heck of a job, and the Bush administration's response to that disaster was in itself a disaster. And that was a turning point in the perception of the competence of the Bush administration. Donnie Two Dolls arrived at what might be the most memorable turning point in his presidency when he himself expressed the damage his tariffs are doing in terms that any child in America could understand, especially a girl hoping for a Barbie for Christmas. What Donald Trump said about that yesterday became the lead story on this program last night and went viral today. And today, Donnie Two Dolls used the furor created by the stupidest thing ever said about Christmas by a president of any country to mask the first firing in the second Trump White House last night on this program. With the generous approval of David Chase, the brilliant creator of the Emmy-winning HBO series The Sopranos, I suggested the possible nickname Donald Trump would have if he were a character on The Sopranos. And I suggested that that nickname should be Donnie Two Dolls after he said this yesterday.
Somebody said, oh, the shelves are going to be open. Well, maybe the children will have 2 dolls instead of 30 dolls, you know? And maybe the 2 dolls will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally.
After I made the Donald Trump's Two Dolls theory of Christmas the lead story on this program last night, called him Donnie Two Dolls, to both prove the intellectual rot of the Trump tariff scheme and how Donald Trump is now pushing voters away from him, pushing supporters away from him with Scrooge-like comments. Donald Trump's favorite hometown newspaper, the New York Post, the newspaper owned by Donald Trump's billionaire friend Rupert Murdoch, the newspaper that has always treated Donald Trump favorably as a gossip item before he got into politics, agreed with me that the Two Dolls was the most important thing Donald Trump said yesterday, and Donnie Two Dolls woke up to find this as the cover of today's New York Post. Skimp on the Barbie. Trump admits tariffs will raise prices, cause shortages. It's that simple. And it's on the front page, the cover of a pro-Trump newspaper. Anyone can understand that. Any child who might have seen that cover of the New York Post today could understand that. That is a right-wing Republican newspaper, and even that Trump-supporting newspaper knows how stupid and politically disastrous it was for Donald Trump to turn himself into Donnie Two Dolls yesterday. That phrase went out there in the world today. Protesters were using it on their placards. I think we have some shots of this that we can show you. There's one from Manhattan today. Protesters out there against Donald Trump. Others from other places in the country today dumped Donnie Two Dolls. It really moved because it is so easy to understand. It is just so simple. And so Donald Trump chose today to make the biggest change in the White House staff since Inauguration Day, hoping that the disaster at the core of that story about Donnie Two Dolls could be muted. He might be able to mute the story that he was creating for himself today. Today, Mike Waltz set a record for Donald Trump's first choice for National Security Advisor. Mike Waltz made it all the way to the 101st day of the Trump presidency before being removed from that position. The man who says he always chooses the right people, the best people, got rid of his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, on the 101st day of service, which means that Mike Waltz served 4 times as long as Donald Trump's first choice of national security advisor in the first Trump White House. Michael Flynn served 22 days as national security advisor in Donald Trump's first White House before Donald Trump fired him and before Michael Flynn then went on to become a convicted criminal who Donald Trump then pardoned. So if Donald Trump chooses you for national security advisor and your first name is Michael, you are going to be the first person he fires in a Trump White House. He has a perfect record on that. The removal of Mike Waltz was, like most Trumpian moves, not carefully planned. The carefully planned version of such a move includes the immediate announcement of an impressive choice to be the next national security advisor, preferably someone who is seen more favorably than the one who's getting kicked out. But Donald Trump had no one. That's a turning point, too. Donald Trump had no one today to put into that job. The most important job in the White House after president and vice president. Today, Donald Trump needed a new national security advisor, and he couldn't find one. So he made Secretary of State Marco Rubio the acting national security advisor. Mike Waltz was removed from that job after organizing a group chat that included the CIA director, the director of national intelligence, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and others to make sure that everyone was informed, and in some cases over-informed, about an air attack that the United States was about to launch in Yemen. One of the people Mike Waltz included in that group chat, not on secure technology, was the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, Jeffrey Goldberg, who wrote all about it, exposing the single biggest security breach by a national security advisor in history. Every participant in that group chat had a professional responsibility to check the list of everyone else they saw on that group chat to make sure that it was safe. But the CIA director didn't do that. The incompetent director of national intelligence didn't do that. The incompetent Secretary of State didn't do that. The incompetent Secretary of Defense didn't do that, and shared battle plans. None of them fulfilled their security responsibility in that group chat on an unsecure platform. So they all exhibited rank incompetence in their jobs just by participating in a group chat over that non-secure forum. But it was Mike Waltz's phone that specifically linked Jeffrey Goldberg into the conversation. And in any sane White House, Mike Waltz would have been fired as soon as that was discovered. Donald Trump decided to give Mike Waltz an exit parachute today that might not be easy to operate because it includes Senate confirmation. Donald Trump intends to nominate Mike Waltz to be ambassador to the United Nations, which requires Senate confirmation. Donald Trump already dropped his first choice for ambassador to the United Nations, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, after the Speaker of the House panicked about losing another Republican member of the House of Representatives to the Trump administration. And so Donald Trump's first choice for national security advisor has become his second choice for UN ambassador and will be answering questions under oath in a Senate confirmation hearing about the not secure group chat that he set up to discuss specific times and targets of a battle plan, the kind of information that has always been classified since the invention of classified information. Mike Waltz's defense under oath in his confirmation hearing will probably be what they've been saying up to now, which is that the battle plan wasn't classified, which is the single worst defense anyone could possibly suggest in a case like this, acceptable only in Trump world, which means Republican senators will likely be shaming themselves once again in accepting this unique definition of classified, and in this case, accepting the dangerous incompetence of Donald Trump's so-called best people. Mike Waltz's Senate confirmation hearing will give Democrats an opportunity once again to highlight the startling and dangerous incompetence of Donald Trump and his national security advisor and his director of the CIA, his director of national intelligence, his Secretary of State, who is also now the acting national security advisor, and his spectacularly incompetent Secretary of Defense, who shared the actual specifics of the battle plan on that crazy group chat that they had. The childish incompetence of that Trump national security team will be on display in Mike Waltz's confirmation hearing. And American voters will have no problem understanding it because it is so simple. High school kids will have no problem understanding how stupid and incompetent you have to have your group chat leak publicly. The Trump presidency is sinking. The cruelty will continue. He will continue to try to deport children who are American citizens. He will continue to try to imprison in El Salvador people who have committed no crimes. He will publicly revel in his cruelty to people for whom Trump voters have shown very little sympathy. That will continue. But so much of the rest of what Donald Trump is trying to do is sinking. The Trump voters who have showed up at rallies, which is a very tiny percentage of Trump voters, have always shown sympathy for themselves. They have always shared in Donald Trump's self-pity when Donald Trump would stand at his rallies and whine and complain about how badly he has been treated after he arrived at that rally on his private plane, whose fuel and maintenance was paid for by their campaign contributions. Donald Trump knows how to feel sorry for himself. He's very good at that. And the people at Trump rallies who spoke to reporters seem to be very good at that too. But remember, about 99% of Trump voters have never been to a Trump rally. Donald Trump does enjoy sounding cruel. Donald Trump enjoys sounding threatening. Donald Trump wants to scare his opponents, and he wants to scare any of his political allies in the Republican Party who might ever think of disagreeing with him. The cruelty is not an act. It is one of Donald Trump's genuine, deeply held qualities. It takes unspeakable cruelty for a president of the United States to take the food away from starving children in Africa in the middle of a famine, as Donald Trump and Elon Musk have done. Donald Trump took food away from starving mothers in famine in Sudan, from grandmothers, from grandfathers, hungry children watching their siblings starve to death because of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump decided they don't need any more food from us, even though the United States of America, for the entirety of Donald Trump's life and before that, has produced much more food than we can consume in this country. The farmers who produced that food that the United States Agency for International Development was using to feed starving children in Africa were all paid in full for that food. The federal government paid American farmers for that food that the American government then delivered to starving children, and it was as tiny a budget item as exists in the federal government. And only the cold cruelty of Donald Trump could take that food away. No other president ever contemplated such a thing. No matter how negatively someone might think of the overall record of Republican President George W. Bush, he was as caring and kind and, yes, Christian as any president has ever been when trying to help save lives of the poorest people in the world. President George W. Bush did more to save the lives of people dying of AIDS in Africa than any other president. And in doing so, George W. Bush was following not just good governing policy, not just smart international relations, and not just principled altruism. He was following the Christian teachings that he actually believed about loving thy neighbor, about how we treat, as the Bible put it, the least among us. The most behaviorally and philosophically unchristian president in history today at the White House, after becoming Donnie Two Dolls yesterday, participated in a national day of prayer without ever having been able to publicly recite a prayer in his life from memory. Donald Trump embodies cruelty, not Christianity. Donald Trump cannot hide the cruelty and cannot control the cruelty. And that is why, when he was asked about the fact that 80% of the toys sold in this country come from China and 90% of all Christmas products come from China, Donald Trump couldn't find words that it would express any sympathy for anyone, for any child who might not get that toy that they were dreaming about on Christmas Day because of Donald Trump. So Donnie Two Dolls said, well, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, you know? That's the sound of a cruel billionaire. That's the sound of someone rich enough to think that $30 under the tree is a common experience for children in America. And that's a billionaire mean enough to think that everyone should just calm down and follow his advice at how many dolls should be under a Christmas tree. But Donnie Tudall's breathtakingly cold statement about the children of America is the clearest thing he has said to Americans and to Trump supporters about how lost he is, about how incapable he is of serving the needs of anyone in America, including children, who can now understand how stupid and incompetent their president is, including children who came out to support Donald Trump during the presidential campaign. Campaign reporters sometimes have to do some gimmicky things. Sometimes their producers want them to do things like interview the kids at the campaign rally. NBC's Shaq Brewster is as good as it gets on the campaign trail. And he has conducted many important interviews during campaigns and during important breaking news events in this country. He has appeared on this program repeatedly during some of those breaking news events. And last September, at a Trump rally, Shaq Brewster conducted an interview that was fun. You can tell how much fun Shaq Brewster had. You can tell how he's enjoying talking to these two Trump supporters. One thing you're not expecting in an interview with children at a campaign rally is anything substantive. But Shaq Brewster's interview with two young girls in Michigan in September stands tonight as possibly the most important campaign rally interview conducted by anyone in that campaign, because it shows precisely what Trump supporters expected of Donald Trump, and it shows precisely how clear it is and how clear it can be to Trump supporters now what a total failure Donald Trump has become to them. Two wonderful young girls at a Trump rally named Stella and Maeve, with the full support and approval of their father, asked to be interviewed by Shaq Brewster. They asked for that moment in front of a TV camera. And we are so lucky tonight that they did ask to be interviewed, and that Shaq Brewster had the good grace to do it, and importantly, as you'll see, the skill to recognize that there was actually some real substance to be gained in this interview of children at a campaign rally. What you're about to see is the full range of the age of Americans who can understand exactly how Donald Trump's tariffs work against them. Here is the campaign interview that deserves to be seen by every American of every age.
What do you want him to do? What do you want him to say today?
I want him to lower prices and lower the taxes and make Barbies cheaper.
Make Barbies cheaper?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. Have they gotten expensive?
Yeah, and Polly Pockets. All my favorite toys are so expensive.
Make Barbies cheaper. It just doesn't get simpler than that. It doesn't get easier to understand than that. That is a simple request. And Donnie Tudall said yesterday he is sure that the parents of young girls hoping for a Barbie won't mind paying, as he put it, a couple of bucks more. Barbie has made billions upon billions of dollars for Americans over the course of the life of that remarkable doll. And recently, Barbie made even more billions of dollars for Americans by becoming a movie character. And not a single Barbie in history, that most American of dolls, has ever been made in the United States of America, not one. But Barbie has managed to make Americans richer in many ways. And the vast fortunes made on Barbie are American fortunes. And because Donald Trump doesn't understand economics, and because Donald Trump doesn't understand the huge value of international trade, And because Donald Trump doesn't understand little girls, Donald Trump thinks Barbie is an enemy of America because Barbie is not made here. That's how much Donald Trump doesn't understand about America. That's how much Donald Trump doesn't understand about what a real enemy is. He thinks Barbie is an enemy. That's how much Donald Trump doesn't understand about his youngest supporters and the fathers and the mothers of those youngest supporters who were really hoping and believing that he would make Barbies cheaper. It doesn't get simpler. The obvious failure of Donald Trump does not get simpler. The New York Times picked up today on Donnie Tudall's cold comments about the $2 limit he wants to see under Christmas trees. The Times reports this grinchy pronouncement by the president had the value of being truthful. Many American toy makers and retailers have started to pause their orders as the effects of Mr. Trump's tariffs ripple out, threatening to snarl supply chains. It could all have a big impact on this year's holiday season since it takes months to manufacture, package, and ship many products to the United States. The Independent reports, quote, in a Toy Association survey of 410 small and medium-sized toy manufacturers taken this month, 64% of small toy companies and 80% of mid-sized toy companies said they have canceled orders. Meanwhile, roughly half said they would go out of business within weeks or months if U.S. tariffs on China remained in place. Jennifer Bergman, the owner of West Side Kids in New York City, told the New York Times, quote, that she would try to buy as much as she could now, but that the shortages were already starting. If the tariffs remain, Christmas will be like something we've never experienced before, Ms. Bergman said. People will be standing in line to buy things that cost twice or 3 times as much as before, she said. Her business is already under pressure from competition by Amazon, but she fears that the tariffs will deliver a final blow. I don't think I will be in business for Christmas, said Ms. Bergman, who added that she was consulting a bankruptcy lawyer. The most expensive product the United States of America has ever exported in history is a Boeing commercial airliner. That's the most expensive object in the world. And international orders for Boeing commercial airliners now face the possibility of being canceled, which could ultimately drive Boeing out of business thanks to Donald Trump's tariffs. We used to have several manufacturers of commercial airliners in the United States. Then we got down to 3, then we got down to 2, and we have been at 1 for a long time now. And Donald Trump could be the president who loses that 1. And then we become the country that manufactures 0 commercial airliners. The Trump tariffs could do that. But if you're a little girl who doesn't know anything about the cost of that airplane that you're flying on Christmas vacation, you understand the price of Barbies. General Motors announced today that the Trump tariffs will wipe out about 1/4 of the profit of America's biggest car company, what they were hoping for this year. And if you're a little girl who doesn't understand what General Motors is, doesn't understand that your car, your family car is a General Motors car, you understand the price of Barbies. And that's a big problem for Donald Trump, that everyone at every age now is learning the hard way about what Donald Trump is doing to prices. Children can learn this now. A Barbie that cost $20 last Christmas will cost $50 this Christmas at least, unless Donald Trump surrenders in his trade war with China. And that price rise is not, as Donald Trump put it, a couple of bucks. It's 150%. That's his tariff, 145% on Barbies from China. It cost $50 this month. If you can get a Barbie, if you'll be able to get one, if the shortages don't hit in the toy store on the day you're going in there, that's not a couple of bucks more. No. Donnie Two Dolls doesn't understand what he's doing. He has no idea what he's doing. He has never understood tariffs. And now little girls in America know that Donald Trump doesn't know what he's doing. Even they know. Everyone knows. This is a turning point. Last night, Kamala Harris said this.
Courage is contagious. The courage of Americans who are banding together in the face of the greatest man-made economic crisis in modern presidential history. Americans across the political spectrum who are declaring that the president's reckless tariffs hurt workers and families by raising the cost of everyday essentials, devastate the retirement accounts that people spent a lifetime paying into, and paralyze American businesses, large and small, forcing them to lay off people, to stop hiring or pause investment decisions. I understand why. And it's certainly true of those tariffs. Tariffs that, as I predicted, are clearly inviting a recession.
Leading off our discussion tonight is Democratic Senator Adam Schiff of California. He's a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, the Agriculture Committee, and the Small Business Committee. And Senator, small business is, of course, understandably in a panic about what Donald Trump's tariffs are doing to them. And it is so clear and easy for them to understand. It's now easy for children to understand what he's doing to the price of Barbies. And it seems to me that the incompetence demonstrated there is of a piece with the incompetence demonstrated in the Mike Waltz story that has finally ended with him being removed as the National Security Advisor.
I think that's true. And what really stands out to me about Mike Waltz's firing is, first of all, how long it took. It's been over a month since the whole Signalgate story broke. No one was held accountable for the longest time. And the reason no one was held accountable is Donald Trump didn't want the embarrassment of acknowledging that something really wrong took place that endangered our national security, didn't want to reward, in his view, journalists who brought this to light, including Jeffrey Goldberg. None of the calculation involved national security. None of the calculation involved any real accountability. For him, it was delaying to avoid embarrassment. And similarly, the decision to exile Walz to be the secretary at the UN, or ambassador to the UN, says a couple of things about the president as well. One is, hey, this was another way of kind of changing the storyline. We're not getting rid of him. He's not being punished. We're just giving him this new responsibility. But it also says how little the president respects the office of ambassador to the United Nations, how little he values our diplomacy or that body. Basically, this is a way to get him out of the president's sight and do so in a way that minimizes the president's embarrassment. Again, our diplomatic needs could care less. The national security imperative and risks, not really the issue here. It's all about avoiding embarrassment for the president.
Senator Schiff, please stay with us. When we come back, I want to talk to you about this stalled confirmation in the Senate because of a Nazi sympathizer and an admirer of Adolf Hitler that's involved in all of this. We're going to be right back with Senator Schiff. Thank you. Once again today, the Republican-controlled Senate Judiciary Committee delayed the confirmation hearing of Donald Trump's nominee for U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. Senator Adam Schiff knows exactly why.
This is Ed Martin. Here he is doing an introduction of his friend, Timothy Hale Cuccinelli.
He's an extraordinary man, extraordinary leader now of those who have survived January 6th. And I think he's resisted this, but I don't care because I have I bought this microphone and I want him to come up.
Now you might ask, so what's the problem with that introduction? The problem with that introduction is Timothy Hale Cuccinelli. Here's a photo of Timothy Hale Cuccinelli portraying one of his apparent heroes. Timothy Cuccinelli is a avowed anti-Semite, admirer of the Fuhrer, someone who has talked about wanting to eat Jews for lunch and dinner. This is the guy that Ed Martin is saying is an extraordinary person that we want to hear more for. It's a leader the country needs to hear more from. Really, does the country need to hear more anti-Semitic bile from this guy? I don't think so. But this is just one of the many reasons why I'm trying to kill this nomination.
And Senator Schiff is back with us. Senator, what would a confirmation hearing of Ed Martin look and sound like? Presumably we'd hear everything that this Hitler worshiper has said that Ed Martin must have known about.
Yes, and more than that, Lawrence, in the questions that we posed to him in writing, he really tried to deny the closeness of his relationship with Cuccinelli. In other interviews, and very much after the fact, he has tried to distance himself and say that I wasn't aware of that photograph. I wasn't aware of the things that he had said. But we have these podcasts now that he did with Cuccinelli, where he talks about the closeness of his relationship, where he acknowledges the photo and that he's aware of the photo. So we would be able to question him about all of these contradictions, which are statements he has made now under oath. But more than that, the fondness for this Hitler admirer is only one of the indictments against Ed Martin. You also have the fact that he has no prosecutorial experience. His only real relevant experience is being a Stop the Steal lawyer. He has said in connection with January 6th that we should go easier on people who beat cops. He has called for reparations to be paid, not to the victims, but to the perpetrators, that the people that were convicted of January 6 crimes deserve not just restitution, but reparations. He has moved to dismiss cases against January 6 defendants as the acting U.S. attorney who remained his clients. So he was on both sides of that prosecution. The list goes on and on and on. It includes his failure to disclose hundreds of appearances on Russian propaganda, RT and Sputnik. So that's what a hearing would look like. It would confront him with all of his false answers under oath. It would walk through all of the outrageous statements he's made about law enforcement, January 6th, and it would hold him accountable for propping up, lifting up this avowed anti-Semite.
There are members of that Judiciary Committee, like Senator Cruz, Senator Hawley, who dream of running for president, in Cruz's case, again someday, or being on the vice presidential slot on the ticket. A vote for this nominee would attach those Hitler worship comments to them throughout the future of their political careers.
It would, and I guess it really depends on what is the state of the Republican Party when they run for president or run for president again. If it still resembles this MAGA party that has people like Elon Musk doing Hitler salutes and Steve Bannon doing Hitler salutes, then maybe that's not a disqualification from being the nominee of the Republican Party. But I think for others on the Judiciary Committee who have expressed reservations, they have deep concerns about associating themselves or their votes with this guy. He has attacked Senator Cornyn, and he's attacked Senator Collins, and he's made disparaging remarks about Senator Curtis. Senator Tillis has expressed his own concerns about Martin's denigration of police officers and law enforcement on January 6th. So a lot of the Republicans have serious reservations about this guy, which is why I think his nomination is in such limbo.
Senator Adam Schiff, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you. Coming up, a small business owner who employs 500 people fears the Trump tariffs will destroy his business and put those people out of work. He's suing Donald Trump over the Trump tariffs and will join us next. I saw our next guest in an interview about tariffs, Trump tariffs, yesterday, and I immediately asked if he could join us on this program because he speaks so knowledgeably and wisely about what the Trump tariffs are doing to American businesses like his own. And he is suing over the Trump tariffs, accusing the Trump administration of, quote, an extraordinary executive branch power grab. The lawsuit says the president has asserted the authority to impose tariffs, essentially taxes, on imports from any country on any schedule, in any amount, and for any policy reason couched as an emergency. Neither the Constitution nor the International Emergency Economic Powers Act grants the president tariff levying authority at all, let alone of the limitless type asserted here. And joining us now is Rick Woldenberg, CEO of Learning Resources, which has been making award-winning educational toys for over 40 years. Mr. Woldenberg, thank you for educational toys. They're my favorite kind. And I know this is day to day for you, and every day there's a new notion of what you're, or a new endurance at this point. What would you say about where we are today after the day after Donald Trump said, $2 under the Christmas tree should be the most anybody ever wants?
Well, the let them eat cake remarks that they make demean our business. They insult our people and they dismiss our customers. But what's really revealing when they say kids can have $2 rather than 30 is they're really suggesting that this is beneath them. And the thing that's really frustrating about that is I believe that just reveals it's a regressive tax. It's a tax that falls on the weaker people economically. They pay the tax. Donald Trump, Scott Bessent, Howard Lutnick don't pay it. And as a result, it's going to depress our economy because those are all my customers.
And as you go forward, what do you think your customers and voters and people out there need to know about what can happen to a company like yours if these tariffs stay in place?
Well, it's pretty obvious. I've been turned into a tax collector. The tax that we are expected to pay is many times our annual profit. So there's no place to get it except through a price increase. Now, our average price increase the last 2 years was about 1.5%. We kept it under the rate of inflation because what we feel is that we should show more productivity every year. So we take some risk on our side. But this year, we're going to have a mid-year price increase. And once we figure out what our costs are, but it's impossible to do that, of course, we're going to have to figure out how much to raise our prices to recapture the tax. Plain and simple.
We're hearing from people in your position that you don't know what to order, when you can order it. If you placed an order for something now, by the time it gets to you, it could cost 150% more than it costs today.
Well, I have no idea what it's going to cost. So the products from China, we can't get from China. By the way, the products that we make in China are our products. We own the intellectual property. We design in the United States. We outsource manufacturing to China. But we can't make our products in China because I can't pay the 145%, period, the end. So I have to move like a refugee to higher ground somewhere else. And I don't really know what's going to be there. I don't have costs there, and they haven't told me what the tariff is. So I could spend millions of dollars and not a small amount of effort relocating from China to someplace else, only to find I have to move again. So the consumer's going to pay for that.
Mm-hmm. Rick Woldenberg, thank you very much for joining us tonight. And I have been waiting for this lawsuit. I have been waiting for a victim of the tariffs, which is to say a business that actually pays them, because your legal reading of these tariffs is exactly what my legal reading of them has always been. Thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And coming up, a federal judge appointed by Donald Trump ruled today that Donald Trump cannot use a 1798 law for his deportations. That's next. On his first day in office this year, Donald Trump said this.
By invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, I will direct our government to use the full and immense power of federal and state law enforcement to eliminate the presence of all foreign gangs.
And now a federal judge appointed by Donald Trump says that's illegal. The New York Times reports today a federal judge on Thursday permanently barred the Trump administration from invoking the Alien Enemies Act, an 18th century wartime law to deport Venezuelans it has deemed to be criminals from the Southern District of Texas, saying that the White House use of the statute was illegal. The decision by the judge, Fernando Rodriguez Jr., was the most expansive ruling yet by any of the numerous jurists who are currently hearing challenges to the White House's efforts to employ the powerful but rarely invoked law as part of its wide-ranging deportation plans. Judge Fernando Rodriguez Jr., who was appointed by Donald Trump, wrote this about Donald Trump's proclamation invoking the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. The proclamation makes no reference to and in no manner suggests that a threat exists of an organized armed group of individuals entering the United States at the direction of Venezuela to conquer the country or assume control over a portion of the nation. Thus, the proclamation's language cannot be read as describing conduct that falls within the meaning of invasion for purposes of the Alien Enemies Act. The court concludes that the president's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act through the proclamation exceeds the scope of the statute and, as a result, is unlawful. Respondents do not possess the lawful authority under the Alien Enemies Act and based on the proclamation to detain Venezuelan aliens, transfer them within the United States, or remove them from the country. That is tonight's last word.